Okay. Well, my last research analyzes the mediations of the Spanish hunger years from 1939 to 1952 in recent secondary school history textbooks, which is a key issue due to both its educational and its societal relevance, since the Spanish famine, unlike other European famines, has not yet found its way into the public debate. And I find interesting connections with the previous presentations on the Holodomor, as both famines took place under authoritarian regimes that imposed silence on them. Well, I will briefly expose the main objectives, the textbooks that I have analyzed, the analysis I have carried out, specifically the terminology, the approaches, the resources, and the interpretations, and finally, the main conclusions. Well, the main goal is to analyze how the Spanish hunger years have been represented in the teaching units devoted to the Francoist regime in the history school books recently issued by different publishers. Secondly, this study aims to propose curricular alternatives designed to give the subject greater weight and to advance towards a more complex narrative that incorporates the recent historiographic contributions on the subject of the hunger, of the post-war hunger. To achieve these aims, different history textbooks for secondary schools published by different publishers have been examined. I've looked at the two education courses in which the history of Spain is studied. In particular, I've analyzed 11 textbooks from second year of Bachillerato. This is the pre-university studies for students aged between 17 and 18 years, and 10 textbooks from the fourth year of ESO. This is the compulsory secondary education for students aged between 15 and 16 years. The sample is representative as small and large and progressive and conservative publishers have been included. The terminology used by the different publishers when dealing with the topic of the hunger years is quite revealing. The word famine, which implies the recognition of the decrease in the people's purchasing power and the deaths due to starvation or to diseases derived from malnutrition, is only explicitly used in two of the textbooks analyzed. Nonetheless, it is significant that in neither case the reference is included in the main body of the text, but in less conspicuous places, which indicates that the authors don't consider this term a priority. A term more commonly found in the textbooks is the hunger years, which has undergone a longer historiographic journey and refers to a food crisis of a lesser magnitude than the famine. And this is used by the main publishers. Some of the older editions don't even include that category, resorting to euphemisms like food shortage. As far as the predominant historiographic focuses in the textbooks are concerned, the subject of the hunger years is still often approached from within a political, institutional, and economic history that pays little attention to the repercussions of the autarky on the living conditions of the common people. Nevertheless, some textbooks deal with the subject from a more sociocultural and everyday perspective, which is reflected in both the teaching materials and the contents. And well, it seems to me a wise choice, as only by offering this approach from social perspective is it possible to recreate what the famine actually meant and to understand it. On the other hand, all the textbooks lack a comparative perspective. And well, although it is likely that these deficiencies shared with other national curriculum, maybe we could discuss this later. Well, Spanish textbooks don't compare the hunger years with other past national or international contexts. None of the textbooks analyzed refers to other contemporary European famines, such as the Ukrainian Holodomor or the Dutch hunger winter, that bear many similarities to the situation in Spain. About the resources, multiple and varied primary sources are used. Some textbooks include interesting documents, such as the magnificent report written in 1940 by the British cultural attaché in Madrid, Robert Starkey, in which he said that it was very common to see men, women, and even children faint in the street due to undernourishment. Well, I find this document very valuable for showing students a reality covered up by the Francoist censorship, as it happened with the international journalists who visited Ukraine during the Holodomor, like Mr. Jones. Moreover, one of the textbooks uses oral sources, first-hand memories, which allows the approach towards the Hunger Years from a more sociocultural and everyday perspective. In particular, it records the words of a black marketeer who operated in Madrid in 1950. Some of the textbooks include tables and graphs that offer quantitative illustrations of official prices or food rationing. And they also take advantage of cultural resources such as films or novels set in the post-war period. However, although a wide selection of material is used, it is not always profoundly or rigorously worked with. This can be seen clearly in the illustrations. They generally serve as a mere aesthetic decoration that accompany the explanations, but with no sign of analysis to take advantage of them as available teaching resources. We find an example in the Bachillerato textbook edited by Editex in 2016, in which a photograph, well, this photograph of a bakery in post-war Spain is included, but the caption only indicates rationing characterized post-war Spain. So in addition to a lack of context, as the photographer or location or data are missing, the opportunity to include relevant information related to the picture is lost. But it is in the interpretations of the Hunger Years where the most substantial differences between the textbooks can be detected. The Hunger Years took place in the broader context of the autarky, and many of the textbooks accurately attribute its introduction by the Franco regime to ideological factors. However, other textbooks give students the false impression that the dictatorship was forced to adopt the autarky by the circumstances, in particular the damages caused by the civil war from 1946 to 1939, or the international isolation of the regime after the Second World War. And when it comes to explaining the reasons behind the failure of economic interventionism, some textbooks appear to reiterate the Francoist discourse by attributing the poor results to climatological adversities. Well, these approaches are not the most appropriate, as various economists have long since contested the myths of an iron-fisted international isolation and a persistent drought. Some of the textbooks dwell on the distinct impact of the famine according to socioeconomic factors, which seems appropriate, as historiography has shown that the poorer classes were afflicted most severely. However, not all textbooks clarify that not everybody was equally impacted by the famine. Similarly, not all textbooks give the same importance to regional factors in evaluating the severity of the famine, while it is known to have had a greater impact on the south of the country. What is more, some textbooks include geographical differences inappropriately, maintaining that the urban areas suffered more than the rural areas, thus causing a migratory movement from the cities to the villages. Regarding the quantification of the famine-related victims, deaths due to starvation, were a daily reality in some provinces and that the dictatorship did its best to cover up, are not mentioned. Furthermore, none of the textbooks offers statistics regarding the number of people who perished directly or indirectly due to hunger. With respect to the representation of the substandard housing, which many families lived in overcrowded and insalubrious conditions, many textbooks present it correctly as one of the more visible consequences of food shortage and food shortages and poverty. Nevertheless, it is again surprising that the housing problem is only spoken of in relation to the large cities. Likewise, secondary school textbooks refer to the increase in infectious and contagious diseases, as well as those deriving from malnutrition that were closely related to hunger and substandard housing. Nevertheless, none of the authors considers it necessary to refer to other health effects deriving from the famine, such as the increase in the number of suicides. Maybe because it is still considered a taboo subject or inappropriate for the intended students. About the popular responses to hunger, they were similar to those under other European famines, such as the Greek or the Dutch. And all secondary school textbooks refer in broad terms to the black market. However, textbooks often don't emphasize sufficiently that alongside a large black market linked to corruption, there was a small subsistence black market operated by individuals motivated by hunger. Likewise, more references to other survival strategies that were as widespread as the black market, such as thefts motivated by starvation, which were also a reality during the Holodomor or the Hunger Winter, are also missing. Finally, regarding the role played by women during the post-war period, the textbooks analyzed mainly depict women, as victims instead of as agents capable of overcoming the terrible circumstances of the post-war period. Well, the main conclusion is that the representation of the Spanish hunger years in recent history textbooks for secondary schools varies substantially depending on the publishers. These differences may be attributed to the profile of the authors and to the period of history in which they are specialized. Another factor is the ideological profile with which the different publishers identify themselves. In general, publishers with a progressive profile tend to show a greater interest in the social aspects of the hunger years than do more conservative publishers. And it is not always the oldest books that represent the famine years in the most simplistic way, nor the more recent ones that do so with the greatest complexity. So while there are textbooks that provide complex narrative of the hunger experiences, others represent the period in an oversimplified and outdated way. Moreover, some textbooks continue to implicitly reproduce or perpetuate the oblivion that the Franco dictatorship tried to impose on the Hunger Years. What is more, to a large extent, the pretexts put forward by the dictatorship to justify the food crisis are still present in some of the textbooks today, So how does this forgetfulness work? Well, firstly, the textbooks underestimate the magnitude of the food crisis of Franco's post-war period by not referring to deaths due to starvation and not using the category famine. Secondly, a certain homogenization of the victims of the famine is detected, among whom it is not always distinguished by social class or geographical origin, both factors that condition the different experiences of hunger. Thirdly, many textbooks reveal an urban bias, relegating rural areas, the most populated in the 40s, to second place. So many textbooks situate the lack of food and housing in the cities, ignoring the fact that this problem was equally bad or even worse in the countryside. Thanks for your attention.